What's up, Unshactable community, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, as always seen thumbnail on top of today's video, we're going to take a look at my 2007 to 2008 collection. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So we're going to start off with Underdog. Here's the back. Here's the disc. The Simpsons movie. Here's the back. Here's the disc. TMNT. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Dragon Wars. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Rambo. Here's the back. Here's disc 1 and 2. Rush Hour 3. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Hitman. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Meet the Robinsons. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Three Ping. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Bridge of Terabithia. Here's the back. Here's the disc. The Bucket List. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Wild Hogs. Here's the back. Here's the disc. The Nanny Diaries. Here's the back. Here's the disc. I Am Legend. Here's the back. Here's the disc. The Game Plan. Here's the back. Here's the disc. The Golden Compass. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street. Here's the back. Here's disc 1 and 2. August Rush. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Ghost Rider. Here's the back. Here's disc 1 and 2. Forgetting Sarah Marshall. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Die Hard 4. Here's the back. Here's disc 1 and 2. Shooter. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Knocked Up. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Spider-Man 3. Here's the back. Here's disc 1 and 2. Transformers. Here's the back. Here's the disc. And Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. Here's the back. Here's disc 1 and 2. Now moving on to the 2008 collection. We've got Scooby-Doo and the Goblin King. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Hancock. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Kung Fu Panda. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Meet the Spartans. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Bolt. Here's the back. Here's the disc. What Happens in Vegas. Here's the back. Here's the disc. the Star Wars Clone Wars. Here's the back. Here's Disc 1 and 2. Camp Rock. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Yes Man. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Get Smart. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Wanted. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Quantum of Solace. Here's the back. Here's Disc 1 and 2. Death Race. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Bank Job. Here's the back. Here's the disc. The Incredible Hulk. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Body of Lies. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Gran Torino. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Hellboy 2, The Golden Army. Here's the back. Here's the disc. 21. Here's the back. Here's the disc. Iron Man. Here's the back. Here's Disc 1 and 2. Twilight. Here's the back. Here's Disc 1 and 2. And The Dark Knight. Here's the back. Here's Disc 1 and Disc 2. And to end off this video, we've got a 2007 Blu-ray, The Kingdom. Here's the back. Here's the Blu-ray. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope you all have enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Also, 2009 and 2010 collection will be on the way, so be out on the lookout for that. And I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.